Hello and welcome to the next edition of Fridays with Fintelekt. My name is Shirish Pathak. I head Fintelekt Advisory Services. And for those of you who don't know us, we are focused on research, training, and advisory in the area of anti-money laundering and countering terrorist financing and financial crime-related matters. In Fridays with Fintelekt, we will publish a webcast every Friday at which I will engage in conversation with thought leaders in the AML CFT domain in our quest to bring you additional knowledge and insights in this fast-moving field. My guest today is Hala Bou Alwan, a good friend and a very accomplished professional. She is the founder and CEO of Hala Bou Alwan Consultancy, a specialized firm in GRC advisory and training. Hala is a lawyer who holds 3 master's degrees in AI, financial crime, international business law, and cybersecurity from Las Vegas University, Lebanon, and Boston University, USA. She is an experienced leader with more than 18 years in this field and is considered a thought leader in governance, risk, compliance, AML, CFT, sanctions, cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, and virtual assets. Hala, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Shirish, for having me today, and thank you for organizing this fantastic podcast and webinars. I think it's very timely and it's helping the community. And I'm very happy to be with you again after our event in Tech Sutra last year.
Well, my first question to you is, it appears that one of the main concerns for banks currently is how to comply with compliance communication guidelines, as a large percentage of operations staff is working from home, leading potentially to backlogs. So in your interaction with banks, especially in the Middle East, are you seeing this as a compliance challenge?
Thank you, Shirish. It's definitely a great question. Communication in all its types, whether regulatory, whether compliance, whether customer communication, internal communication, all of them are affected and are affected hugely, actually big time. And when we say communication, one of the things which we need to keep in mind is not to limit communication to the compliance part of communication or governance communication. Communication, like to make it easier, can be of 2 types. It's external, with customers, with third parties, with regulators, with governments, with enforcement agencies, investigation unit, or it can be internal, within the organization, with the staff, with the board. So there are 2 types of communication, internal and external. And if you ask me if they are affected, both of them are impacted big time. So what the firm should do in this case, the most important thing, despite it's hard to say, it's hard actually to implement, sorry, I urge like banks and firms not to panic. There is definitely a panic mode, but not to panic, and just be aware that with structure in place, we minimize the damage as much as possible. So the first important thing is to create a pandemic task force. And this pandemic task force, their main mission is to facilitate the communication between staff, IT, compliance, HR, customers, regulators, enforcement agencies. So, and when we go, like, if we want to make it more specific and practical for firms, for example, if we ask a question, so what should be done with customers and third parties? Like, what are the main key areas which we need to keep in mind? Archiving the communication during working from home is a key. It's very important, and it's a key for like continuity. And it's very definitely along with safeguard measures, of course. It's not enough. Also communicate with customers what has been done behind the scenes to be able to provide them this assurance. Will they have business continuity? Will there be any interruptions in certain areas, for example? Will there be any delays which they might experience? This is very important. And the second question which we ask also, so what we talked about customers and third parties. So what should we do with the staff internally? Like, what are the types of communication which we should keep in mind in order to mitigate any lack of communication risks? Definitely business continuity strategies has to be spelled very clearly among the staff. They should know, everyone should know what to do what's their positions, what are the range of possible scenarios, the duration, the national, like local ones, multinationals for multinationals. There's lots of different dynamics depending on the bank or the organization we're talking about. So they should spell out remote access solutions, emergency procedures that outline how to recover data, equipment, reach employees, security specialists. Also, the backup systems must be well established and responsibilities should be allocated very clearly and communicated. There should be a point person which should be communicating inquiries and sending updates to top executive and board directors, which we will come to that later. Those should not be excluded, especially the board should be included so much into the communication. So the governance communication mechanism should always flow, regardless what is the situation. Also, the firms should communicate all relevant policies and procedures, and make sure that those policies and procedures continue to be implemented despite of the situation. And definitely the security protocols will never be relaxed, specifically in this situation. So also the last question which we ask ourselves is, what about the regulatory authorities, supervisory authority, investigation unit? What should we do? The communication in this situation should be strengthened more than ever. And it's mutual. It's not only from the organization to the regulator or the enforcement agency, it's vice versa. They should encourage the entity to report, to submit suspicious transaction reports, to submit any concern, raise any concern they have, that they should encourage this continuous dialogue between supervisors and the banks, especially when working remotely. So they should have this safe mechanism, like I can reach the regulator despite anything, I can take their advice, I can continue submitting. And regulators and enforcement agencies should show them back that they are there, they are alert, they are ready in order to answer any questions, take action. So this is very important on those three levels. As you mentioned, customers, third parties, staff, and regulatory authorities and enforcement agencies. Thank
you. With many banks opting for non-face-to-face KYC, there could possibly be lapses in proper due diligence when onboarding new customers. What are your views on this?
Thank you. Definitely not having face-to-face communication, face-to-face KYC is a challenge, definitely. But banks and other institutions should not accept to be vulnerable to this huge challenge, and not because I'm talking to certain banks and compliance officers, AML, some of them are desperate, they're losing hope, they're saying, oh, so many money laundering attacks will happen to us, terrorist financing, etc. And they don't know what to do because of the panic, which we talked about, which understandable. And yes, we can't do face-to-face KYC in this time, but there are much more alternative things we can use in order to fill in the gaps. It might not be efficient as the face-to-face, but at least if we do several things together and put them together, it will be efficient at the end of the day. So one of the ways we can use is, for example, having alternative proof of identity processes, using electronic copies, scans, photograph of reliable and independent documentation, of course, relying on disclosure certificates to verify certain types of information about customers who are not individuals. However, doing all this and collecting all this documentation, it's not enough. We don't stop there. So first, we shouldn't forget that once we collect those information and we have a preliminary view of it, we have to apply the risk-based approach. Even if the information we have is not as enough as we would love it to be, the risk-based approach should be applied. So it's very important to, not to forget this element specifically. And one of the things which actually caught my attention, I was reading about that after talking to some of my clients and seeing the panic, and wanting to compare other countries, what they are doing versus Middle East. And this doesn't mean that Middle East is not applying these things, but not all the Middle East countries. In the Gulf, we are seeing amazing proactive activities and actions in order to mitigate these risks. However, not all the countries, and I think it's a global thing as well. So Australia caught my attention. They changed their AML rules and everything in order to satisfy this pandemic phase, which make it more flexible, more lenient, definitely at the same time not jeopardizing what should be done. So one of the things which they are applying is using video calls, using Skype, Zoom, face-to-face to compare physical identity of the customer with the scanned and photographed copies of identification documents which they got. Also requiring a customer to have a clear front view selfie of themselves that can be compared with scanned or photographed copies of identification documents. Telephoning the customer to ask questions about their identification, the reason for requesting a designated service, or other questions that would assist in ascertaining whether the customer is who they claim to be. Definitely, as mentioned, it's not easy. However, with those things, whether Zoom, Skype, selfies, all of that, put them together, have a phone call, validate everything together, I think we can do it. We can replace, not permanently, but just now in this phase, the KYC requirement, and I think we can have as much accuracy as possible. Thank you.
Customer behavior and transaction patterns have undergone substantial changes due to the lockdown in various countries. How will this impact the identification of suspicious transactions based on the customer's previously defined profile?
Thank you, Shirish. Definitely, this is a struggle. I was talking to many compliance officers, AML officers, and they said the very same. And one of the things which led to this is wire transfers had dropped a quarter, at least a quarter, since the start of February amid disruptions in the global economy, as everyone knows. Balancing out the surge in cash withdrawals, online banking, cryptocurrency-related activities. So this definitely might create confusion because this is not the regular behavioral pattern. So for example, many bank officials, when you talk to them and they say, it's crazy how people are withdrawing hard currency in a state of panic. And also many people turning into mobile apps who they've never used mobile apps, or because they think it's safer now because of the situation, and many use virtual currency in massive volumes like cryptocurrency and many others in massive amounts, which is not the regular behavioral patterns. And as per the AML officers, this creates sometimes confusion because the massive amount and continuous frequent transactions, which is not a norm with the regular behavior, they confuse them sometimes. It's very hard for them. When you talk to them, they tell you, I can't differentiate anymore between legitimate activity in time of crisis and people are panicking and illegal transactions. So it's really creating this. They can't discriminate. They can't differentiate. Also, FinCEN, actually, I was reading a report on FinCEN on this specific topic, which is very interesting. They said that they are receiving multiple of suspicious transaction reports, flagging attempts by fraudsters to exploit fears of the pandemic, to sell sham cures, for example, raise funds of fraudulent charities, and the victims into handling over money by impersonating even government officials, imagine, among other scams. With all this, many things are happening, and the confusion and the behavioral trend which is changing. Definitely, it's a huge struggle for banks, and actually, I don't want to just limit it to banks. I think this is a struggle among any organization which should do KYC, which, in my point of view, everyone should do KYC for their customers. But definitely, when it comes to financial institutions, it's always of higher risk. So, with all this confusion, again, I urge banks and firms not to overthink and complicate the process. It is complicated as much as it is, and we have those challenges already. So as mentioned, as I always say to and advise clients and help them during these times, structure in place, communication, continue doing what you've been doing, put alternatives to the things you can't do these days because of the social distancing. find alternatives. So undergo the same regular compliance measures and the risk-based approach, which you usually do, but definitely in a much more proactive pace, given the criminal creativity in these times, which we will come also to this, talking about criminal creativity. I think this, this definitely should be included in their compliance program, monitoring plans, policies and procedures, government implementation, what alternatives, what kind of confusion the new behavioral trends of customers might cause, how to deal with it, despite if it's a trend and people are panicking and people are withdrawing so much cash, using cryptocurrency in crazy amounts, crazy volumes. If you still feel there's something suspicious, you're not comfortable, follow the same procedures you always follow and report it. So there's nothing which changed. And also remember FATF recent recommendations. So whatever is required by FATF, you have to apply it even in these times. So if the behavior doesn't make sense, despite there's a crisis, report the case. You report, like you do your responsibility. Do definitely first the due diligence, put things together and continue reporting. Don't confuse things together. Yes, it might be overwhelming. Yes, it might be like, I had a client last week who asked me that they had a very disciplined customer who never withdrew cash in his life. They use online banking, and if they withdraw cash, it's in very small amounts. And these days, he's an old individual. Their customer is like, I think they mentioned like 77 years old. These days, the amount of cryptocurrency transactions and cash withdrawals is crazy. And this is one of their loyal clients who they have since like many years. No single suspicious transaction, low risk client. However, they had to report it because the amount of cash withdrawal didn't make sense. He was withdrawing cash twice a day with large amounts. So this is like a normal example of what's happening. Thank you.
Hala, cybersecurity has come to the forefront during this pandemic, especially as criminals have stepped up their activities in cyberspace. Can you take our listeners through some of the new types of cyber methodologies being used by criminals, including the use of crypto, and also give them some pointers on how to protect their systems and customers from these risks?
Oh, that's a very interesting question, because cyber criminals, I think, out of all criminals, are the most creative during this pandemic times. I was reading something yesterday, and it's very interesting. I urge everyone to read it. It's very interesting. It's released by the FBI, and they say the cyber crimes reports quadrupled during the COVID-19 pandemic. And the creativity is beyond imagination. And they are taking advantage of the COVID-19 crisis and creating all their crimes and attacks. So for example, they are creating fraudulent fraudulent internet domains, setting up fraudulent COVID charities. You'd see a lot COVID charities. I got invited to actually contribute to one, which was also a scam. Promising delivery of masks and other equipment. Specifically now, if you go, for example, to Amazon or other, you'll see like it's out of stock, or you have to wait for 2-3 weeks. So this is an alternative. We provide masks, it's 24 hours, all of that. And then delivered also fraudulent loans, extortion, etc., etc. So that also, in addition to that, FBI highlighted that the health sector is the most targeted these days, actually one of the most targeted these days, and this sector definitely should apply a very strict enhanced due diligence on their supply chains because of what we mentioned, like taking advantage of the COVID-19, specifically when it comes to masks or certain sanitizers, etc., related to the requirements during the crisis. And one of the things which I would actually like to read, because it's said very nicely by the FBI and summarizes everything, that FBI urged everyone to keep in mind, because of this cyber creativity, things which can be considered as warning signs. Okay, I'm going to read it now. the use of urgency and last-minute changes in wire instructions or recipient amount information. Last-minute changes in established communication platform or email account addresses. Communication only in email and refusal to communicate via phone. By the way, this is exactly what happened to me with the charity. When I said, let's have a call, they said we don't have a phone, just we limit it to email communication. Requests for advanced payment of services were not previously required. Requests from employees to change direct deposit information. I think like FBI summarized the warning signs in an amazing way. So I urge everyone to go to the FBI website, and really it's set out there in a very clear way. It spread awareness. It gives you more knowledge on the warning signs and how to mitigate it. So please go and read it. Thank you.
Hala, with global trade reduced due to closing of international borders as well as a reduction in demand, how do you think this will affect trade-based money laundering? Will we see more of service-based money laundering happening? And what should banks do to monitor trade transactions and more effectively deal with suspicious activities related to trade?
Trade-based money laundering, this is something which definitely is affected during the pandemic. And I think the special attention should be given to cross-border trade finance activities when it's linked to medical and pharmaceutical supplies. As you mentioned when we talked about cyber crimes, this is the most targeted area when it comes to trading and trade finance activities. And also I was reading in addition to FBI, there is actually a very nice white paper which is called Trade-Based Money Laundering during coronavirus outbreak, which listed amazing examples on that, and I urge everyone to read it. It's very nice and it's an eye-opener. So the demand of these types of products when it comes to medical and pharmaceutical keep on increasing exponentially, as we know, because of the demand, with the number of positive cases and increasing positive cases and spreading internationally, globally, with volatile prices, of course. Criminals may well try to benefit of that. This is a fantastic area because they take the angle of that we're doing something human, we're helping humanity and health sectors. So banks and non-banking financial institutions should therefore, during this crisis, open their eye and increase the screening and monitoring in these types of transactions, specifically in these areas as we mentioned. Red flags can be, for example, as the regular red flags which we see in trade-based money laundering. However, in these specific areas like over or underpricing, unjustified transportation route, line of business which is unjustifiable, it doesn't make sense, weird location to the company which is doing that distributing it, weird distribution mechanism which doesn't also make sense, and many other things which usually we analyze when it comes to, for example, letter of credit or a letter of guarantee. When we do the analysis for trade-based money laundering, we look about pricing, routing, transportation mechanism, areas, countries of distribution, all of that. So it's the same thing, but please open your eyes when it comes to products related to medical. For example, some of the red flags with this white paper I mentioned highlighted, they said that recently incorporated companies with no or little track record in supplying medical or pharmaceutical products. This is a red flag. Companies having, for example, a track record in supplying medical or pharmaceutical product, where there has been recent change in the controlling structure and where the said controlling structure cannot be properly identified or appear unjustifiably or unusually complex. This is another red flag. Another example mentioned by the white paper, and I'm reading it now just to be accurate, they have just to give them justice. A company is shipping medical or pharmaceutical products to a country and there's no planned cargo, flight or vessel in the specified shipping period or route. That's another high risk. It's a red flag. Trade documents that include vague description of goods and of their nature. A price of goods or shipments that appear manifestly excessive or abnormally high. And the last thing that the paper mentioned, which is also interesting, a company receiving shipment of medical or pharmaceutical products has no economic or lawful justification for this transaction. Example, it is not the usual business activity of the company. So if we see this and we analyze it, as you mentioned, Shirish, it's the same trade-based money laundering activities we do in order to mitigate the risks. However, in this sector related to the crisis. And there are many cases which are caught so far, which is a positive thing. So there's lots of awareness are increased. And in February, there's cases which were not captured. March is more, like we have more captured cases, more reporting, more cases are reported for that because of the awareness, which I think needs to be continuously addressed to banks, financial institutions, and any organization dealing with that. Thank you.
So almost all banks have defined AML governance frameworks in place which articulate how the bank will address risk identification, monitoring, training, technology, as well as the stated or implied risk appetite of the bank. What impact do you think the pandemic situation will create on governance and business conduct of banks?
Thank you, Shirish. It's definitely a very important question. And I think everything we've been talking during this podcast since the beginning till now is about governance. Because as we know, governance is about communication, it's about reporting, it's about continuity, it's about enforcement, it's about transparency, it's about internal controls. And we've talked about all that during the amazing questions which you asked me. So definitely, in order to maintain this governance, which is definitely impacted during the crisis because of the loose ends which we have to tie, because of the social distancing, because of the sudden change of norm of behavior and way of doing things. So again, we go to the panic, we go to the fear, which sometimes creates this gaps in governance. Like putting everything we talked about during this podcast, whether security measures, whether communication, whether fighting crimes, financial crimes and other crimes, whether KYC and identification process, also trade-based money laundering, which is part of the internal controls and fighting crimes, all together, along with the continuity, which every organization should have and set very clearly as we addressed in the beginning. Business continuity should be there. Business continuity, everyone should be included, including the board and the executives. They should be in normal communication together, awareness what's going on. Board meetings should continue. There's no excuse because of the crisis and social distancing. It's the same thing how we're still doing our meetings with our clients. We're doing this podcast together. So continuity is there. We didn't stop. Look at you're doing on daily basis, on weekly basis, like awareness trainings. You didn't stop despite of all the challenges. Same thing every organization should do. Continuity, board meeting as mentioned, same thing, same action points. Definitely we tweak the topics because now maybe the priorities have changed because of that. We included, we discuss it, board committees meet, we take decisions, we take action points. Enforcement, same thing. One of the main elements of governance is enforcement. Enforcement, whether it's external or internal, from regulators to regulated entities, or from regulated entities to their staff. Same thing, enforcement and making sure that people are accountable, and now accountable more than any time before, because people sometimes might feel lazy, lay back, because of working from home, which gives us this, we get lazy sometimes. Because family is there, we're not used to this psychologically, like to act professional all the time. Enforcement, accountability should remain there and be enforced. So the organization should stress on the importance of enforcement because it's a great element of governance. Also, IT governance, this is a huge element and important key of governance, which we shouldn't leave behind. IT governance, whether communication, whether anticipating, for example, additional burdens because now individuals are working remotely, so there might be technology problems. So this is an element of continuity. And as we say, governance is a skeleton of every organization. Continuity keeps the skeleton together. So IT governance is very important. Compliance and risk departments should continuously coordinate with IT, because now it's their core. It's the area, it's the departments which they rely on, because we're all working remotely. And definitely training. There's no excuse that training cannot happen. We are doing trainings, you and me, Shirish, our clients, all the time during Zoom. We are doing this podcast. We are doing webinars. Even there are amazing seminars now. The seminars are replaced by online seminars. So training can be done online. So the training plan which we had, we continue it. HR training, learning and development department should continue these trainings and awareness. And new things now, training on how to deal with these crises, with the business continuity, with new types of KYC, new red flags, behavioral traits, everything we covered in this podcast. And with this, I think we covered communication, transparency, enforcement, all of these important elements of governance. I think with keeping in mind, being aware, being trained, having this extra urge, because I know now sometimes some people might love to take the easy route, since there's a crisis, let me live the crisis and let me not do the duties as I should be doing it. So I urge everyone to keep in mind that this is a phase, this is temporary, it's not permanent at all, it's gonna pass. So whatever you've been doing, continue doing it with being more proactive, keeping in mind that their priorities has changed, and keeping in mind that criminals are being more creative. So be more alert, be more ahead of the game, and psychologically keep reminding yourself that this will pass, but your duties remain the same, wherever you are, working from home or working from office. Thank you so much, Shirish. And thank you very much for having
me. Thank you so much for sharing these insights with us, which I'm sure will be very useful for the Fintelekt community as well as others who watch this.
Thank you so much, Shirish, for having me. It was a pleasure, and I hope we continue doing these things together. Thank you so much, and best of luck.
Listeners, please join us again next Friday for the next session. This is Shirish from Fintelekt signing out.